always smelled of floor wax, and that particular heavy scent of antiseptic that always seems to fail at masking the smell of time passing. Outside the window, the Chicago wind was a low, mournful howl, rattling the glass panes just enough to make you feel the cold even if you were standing right next to a radiator. I remember walking down the linoleum corridor, my boots making a dull, rhythmic thud that felt far too loud in the midday quiet. I was there to see Elias. Elias Thorne was 88 years old, and he was fading. He looked less like a man and more like a collection of memories held together by thin, translucent skin. When I entered room 312, the air felt different. It was still. It was heavy. He was sitting in his armchair, not the bed. He always insisted on the chair. He said the bed was for people who had given up, and Elias Thorne hadn't given up. He was just waiting for the right moment to let go. His hands were resting on his lap. They were large hands, the kind that had clearly spent a lifetime working with steel or soil, but now they were trembling. Not a tremor of disease, but a tremor of profound, focused tension. Between his thumb and forefinger, he held a small, rectangular object. It was an envelope. The paper wasn't white anymore. It had turned the color of a dried tea leaf, brittle and stained with the oils of 6 decades of touch. I pulled up a chair across from him. I didn't say a word for a long time. In my line of work, you learn that the most important things are often said in the gaps between sentences. The clock on the wall was a cheap plastic thing, and its tick was sharp and aggressive, cutting through the silence like a metronome. Each click felt like a heartbeat. Elias looked at me, his blue eyes clouded with cataracts but still holding a piercing, lucid spark. He didn't offer a greeting. He just lifted the letter. He told me he had carried this piece of paper across 3 continents. He had carried it through the jungles of Guadalcanal, where the air was so thick with moisture you felt like you were breathing soup. He had carried it through the reconstruction of Tokyo. He had carried it through 40 years of a quiet marriage to a woman named Martha, who never once asked him what was inside, even though she knew it existed. She had died 5 years prior, taking her curiosity to the churchyard, leaving Elias alone with his paper ghost. I looked at the stamps on the corner. They were old, faded purple and red markings from 1944. The ink of the address was a frantic, elegant cursive, written by a hand that was likely shaking as much then as Elias's was now. It was addressed to Corporal Elias Thorne, but the seal was intact. The glue, though dried and cracked by 60 years of oxygen, still held the flap down. It was a secret that had survived the greatest war in human history, the Cold War, and the turn of a millennium. Elias leaned forward, the leather of his chair groaning under the slight shift of his weight. He told me he could feel the ghost of the ink through the paper. He said that for 60 years, the letter had been a physical weight in his pocket, then his drawer, then his safe box. It was a leaden thing. He told me that as long as it stayed closed, the person who wrote it was still speaking. But the moment he tore that edge, the message would be delivered. The voice would fall silent, and the reality of whatever was inside would become his final truth. He spoke about the night he received it. He was in a foxhole, the smell of cordite and rotting vegetation everywhere. The mail call had been a frantic, messy affair. He had tucked it into his breast pocket, right over his heart, promising himself he would read it when the sun came up. But the sun brought a different kind of fire that day, and by the time the smoke cleared, he found he was terrified of what the letter might say. He feared it was a goodbye, or worse, a reason to want to live when living felt like a betrayal to his fallen friends. I watched as his thumb traced the edge of the envelope. The sound was like a dry autumn leaf scratching against a sidewalk, hollow and crisp. I felt a lump in my own throat. a sudden, sharp realization of my own cowardice. How many letters have I left unopened in my own life? Not physical ones, perhaps, but conversations avoided, apologies held back, truths tucked away in the dark corners of the heart because we are too afraid of the light they might bring. Elias looked at me and asked if I believed in the weight of words. I told him I believed words were the only things we truly leave behind. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He told me he was tired of carrying the weight. He was ready to hear the voice, even if it broke him. I realized then that I wasn't just there to offer him last rites or a prayer. I was there to be a witness to a 60-year-old conversation finally reaching its conclusion. As I sat there, the sun began to dip lower, casting long skeletal shadows of the bare oak trees outside onto the linoleum floor. The room turned amber and gold, a cinematic glow that made the hospital room look like a chapel. Elias took a deep breath, and I could hear the whistle in his lungs, the sound of a machine running out of fuel. He began to slide his finger under the corner of the flap. I wondered, in that moment of absolute stillness, what defines a man more? The secrets he keeps to protect himself, or the courage he finds at the very end to face them? Are we truly afraid of the news we might receive, or are we simply afraid of the person we might become once the truth is finally known? The sound was louder than I expected. It was a sharp, jagged rip that seemed to echo off the sterile white walls of the room. It sounded like a dry bone snapping in a quiet forest, or the first crack of ice on a frozen lake. Elias didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed on the small white sliver of the letter now exposed to the air for the first time since the Truman administration. The smell hit me then, a stale, trapped scent of cedar, old perfume, and the faint metallic tang of a life kept in a box. It was the smell of 1944, preserved in a vacuum of fear and devotion. He pulled the paper out. It was folded into thirds, the creases so deep they looked like scars on the parchment. His fingers, those thick, knotted roots of a man who had survived everything the world could throw at him, trembled so violently I thought the paper would disintegrate before he could read a single word. I reached out, my own hand hovering in the air between us, offering a support I wasn't sure he wanted. I felt the heat coming off the radiator, the dry artificial warmth that makes your skin itch, but my blood felt like it had turned to slush. Elias began to read, his lips moving silently, forming the shapes of words that had no sound. I watched his face. It was a map of every year he had spent waiting. I saw the lines around his eyes deepen, and for a moment the 88-year-old man vanished. In the dim, amber light of the nursing home, I saw the ghost of the boy he used to be. I saw the corporal who had huddled in a trench, the boy who had wondered if he would ever feel the touch of a woman again. I saw the terror and the hope warring behind his clouded pupils. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt in my chest. As a chaplain, I am trained to be the vessel for other people's burdens, but sitting there, I felt like an intruder. I felt like I was standing in the middle of a cathedral during a private confession. This was his soul, laid bare on a piece of yellowed paper, and I was just a witness to the wreckage. It reminded me of a letter I once wrote and never sent, a letter to my own father, filled with the things a son should say, but never finds the breath for. I still have that letter, tucked into the back of my own diary, gathering dust and regret. I wonder if it will be my own Elias Thorne moment one day. Before I tell you what those words did to him, I want you to stop for a second. Look at your own life. We all have that one phone call we're avoiding, that one conversation we've buried under the mundane noise of our daily routines. We tell ourselves we're protecting the other person or protecting ourselves, but are we just curators of our own ghosts? Tell me in the comments below, what is the one thing you've been keeping unsaid, and what would it take for you to finally open that door? Elias cleared his throat. It was a wet, ragged sound that broke the spell of the silence. He didn't look up. He started to read aloud, his voice a low, gravelly hum that felt like it was vibrating in the very floorboards. Dearest Elias, the letter began. The handwriting was a delicate, looping script that seemed to dance across the page. It wasn't a letter of goodbye. It wasn't a Dear John letter like he had feared for 60 long years. It was a map. The woman, Sarah, had written to him about a willow tree by a creek back in Ohio. She had written about the way the light hit the water at 4 in the afternoon, and how she sat there every single day, imagining him sitting right next to her. She wrote that she knew he was scared. She wrote that she knew he felt like he was losing his humanity in the mud of the Pacific. And then she wrote the sentence that broke the dam. She wrote, "I am keeping your goodness safe for you here, so you don't have to carry it there. Just bring yourself back, and I will give it back to you." Elias stopped. A single heavy tear escaped his left eye and rolled slowly down the deep furrow of his cheek, hanging for a moment on his jawline before falling onto the letter. It left a dark, wet circle on the word goodness. He told me that he had spent 60 years believing that the letter contained his destruction. He thought she was leaving him. He thought she had found someone else who wasn't broken by war. He had carried the weight of a betrayal that never existed. He had lived a half-life of suspicion and self-protection, all because he was too afraid to face the truth of her love. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was hollow. It was the silence of a man realizing he had spent 60 years in a prison he had built for himself. The rhythmic beep of a monitor from the hallway felt like a hammer hitting an anvil. I watched him fold the paper back up, his movements slow and agonizingly careful. He looked at me, and his eyes were no longer piercing. They were exhausted. They were the eyes of a man who had finished a race he never should have started. He asked me if God forgives us for the time we waste being afraid. I didn't have an answer for him, not a real one, not one that would fix the 6 decades he had lost. I just sat there, listening to the Chicago wind rattle the glass, wondering how many of us are doing the exact same thing right now. We hold on to the fear because the fear is familiar, while the truth is a stranger we're not sure we can trust. If the truth sets you free, why does the silence feel so much safer? Hospital room 312, 2 nights after the letter. The snow had finally stopped, leaving the world outside the window draped in a heavy, suffocating blanket of white. It was that kind of silence that only comes at 3 in the morning, when the rest of the world is dreaming, and the only people awake are the ones holding on or the ones letting go. I was sitting by the window, the cold from the glass seeping through my wool coat, watching the way the moonlight hit the drifts in the parking lot. The room was dim, lit only by the soft green glow of the heart monitor and a small, flickering prayer candle I had lit on the nightstand. Elias was breathing differently now. It was a rhythmic, shallow sound, the sound of a clock winding down. He had been quiet since the moment we opened the envelope, as if the words Sarah had written were a medicine he was slowly absorbing into his bloodstream. He hadn't asked to read it again. He didn't need to. He had memorized every loop of her cursive, every drop of hope she had poured into that tea-stained paper. It was tucked under his pillow now, a secret weapon against the dark. I stood up and walked over to his side. His skin looked like parchment paper stretched over marble. I reached out and took his hand. It felt like holding a bundle of dry twigs. Yet there was a warmth there that hadn't been present 2 days ago. He opened his eyes, and for the first time in all the weeks I had known him, the fear was gone. The piercing, guarded look that had defined Elias Thorne was replaced by a clarity that was almost unsettling. He whispered her name, just once, Sarah. It wasn't a cry for help or a lament of grief. It was a recognition. It was as if he could see her standing in the corner of the room by the plastic chair where I had sat for hours. He told me he could smell the willow trees. He could smell the damp earth of Ohio after a spring rain. I didn't tell him it was just the scent of the hospital's cleaning fluid. In that moment, his reality was more real than mine. He told me something then that I have carried with me every day since. He said that we spend our lives building fortresses out of our regrets, thinking they will keep us safe from more pain. But a fortress is just another word for a tomb if you never open the gate. He had spent 60 years protecting a version of himself that Sarah had already forgiven. He had carried the guilt of survival and the fear of rejection like a suit of armor, only to realize at the very end that the armor was what was crushing him, not the world outside. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, bruised purple light across the snow, the monitor gave a long, steady tone. It wasn't a jarring sound, it was a release. Elias didn't struggle, he simply exhaled, and with that breath, 60 years of tension left his body. His hand went limp in mine. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the room now absolute, feeling the weight of the moment. I realized that the letter hadn't just been a message, it had been a key. It was the permission he needed to finally believe he was worthy of peace. A week later, I drove out to Ohio. It was a long, lonely drive through the flatlands of the Midwest, the heater in my old car humming a low, buzzy tune. I found the creek he had described. The willow trees were skeletal and bare, their long branches dipping into the icy water, but I could see it. I could see the place where a girl had sat 60 years ago, writing a letter to a boy she loved, promising to hold his goodness safe for him. I took the letter out of my pocket. Elias had asked me to leave it there, under the roots of the largest tree. As I tucked the yellowed envelope into a crevice in the bark, I felt a strange lightness in my own chest. I thought about all the people I've counseled, all the soldiers and the grieving widows, and all the times I've seen them clutching their own unopened letters. We are a species of hoarders, keeping our pain in polished boxes, afraid that if we look at it, we might break. But Elias showed me that breaking is the only way the light gets in. I walked back to my car, the frozen grass crunching under my boots like broken glass. I looked back at the tree one last time. The letter was gone, hidden by the shadows and the wood, returning to the earth that had birthed the woman who wrote it. I realized then that my job isn't just to pray for the dying. It's to remind the living that the truth is never as heavy as the lies we tell ourselves to stay safe. Every time I close my eyes and think of that room, I don't see a dying man. I see a man who finally took off his armor. I see a man who realized that the only thing more powerful than the scars of war is the simple, quiet persistence of love. I still wonder what would have happened if he had opened that letter in 1944. Would his life have been different? Would he have been happier? Perhaps. But maybe the lesson wasn't in the timing. Maybe the lesson was that it's never, ever too late to be found. As we close this chapter of the Chaplain's Diary, I want to ask you one final thing. If you could send a letter to your younger self, the version of you that is currently hiding behind a fortress of fear, what would you say? And more importantly, why haven't you said it yet? If you feel like these stories are helping you find the courage to open your own heart, I invite you to open a new page of this diary with me. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join our community of seekers. Let's face the truth together before the sun goes down. What are you waiting for to be free?